Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's free weekly e-newsletter, Unleashing Your Remarkable Potential, which is full of articles and resources to help you become a more confident and successful leader. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/newsletter. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
It has been a while since I have been with you. For many months, I was with you every Monday at noon. In July, we haven't been for a variety of reasons, but now it's a Friday at noon Eastern time, and I'm glad to be with you, doing a live with a really smart guy, and also recording another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And I'll do all that, sort of officially start that in a second. But before we do that, if you're here with us live, say hello in the comments. Tell us where you're from and get ready to share your questions and comments as we go. I hope you'll do all of that. And I hope you'll settle in for a great conversation with my guest. I'm going to bring him in just a second. But now I'm going to start how this will work for the podcast, okay? In 3, 2, 1. The best leaders are readers. And, well, we hope listeners to this podcast. Seriously, though, the best leaders are readers. And are you a reader? If you are, you want to keep listening and watching. And if you aren't, maybe you secretly wish you were. If that's you, then this may be the most powerful and valuable podcast you ever listen to. I know. It's a bold claim. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see them much sooner. Like if you're listening to this on the podcast, you could have been listening to us months ago. And you can do all that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. And while you're here, if you're here with us live, I want you to imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee. Share your questions, your comments, your ideas, and they will make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode too. Today's episode is brought to you by the Remarkable Masterclass. Every month, we release a new skill in an advanced masterclass format designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. Now, without any further ado, I want to introduce my guest. I've been looking forward to having him. I've been on his podcast, but more about that in a second. First of all, my guest today is Jeff Brown. Jeff is an award-winning radio producer and personality, and formerly a nationally syndicated morning show host. No pressure on Kevin today. Following a 26-year career in radio, Jeff went boss-free in 2013 and soon after launched the Read to Lead podcast, one of my favorites. It has gone on to become a 4-time Best Business Podcast nominee. Jeff has interviewed the who's who in the world of thought leadership, including Alan Alda, Stephen M.R. Covey, Seth Godin, John Maxwell, Liz Wiseman, Gary Vaynerchuk, Simon Sinek, Brian Tracy, Nancy Duarte, and me, along with over 300 more. He coaches podcasters and has consulted on podcasts for the U.S. government, 2 of the largest churches in the U.S., and numerous multi-million-dollar companies. He's the co-author of the brand new book with Jesse Wisniewski. Here it is. Read to Lead, the simple habit that expands your influence and boosts your career. Jeff, welcome. I'm so glad you're here, my friend.
Thank you for having me. What a great introduction. I so appreciate that exuberance and that excitement in your voice. I hope I don't do anything to cause it to wane in the next few minutes.
I highly doubt it. And like I said, we had this conversation when I was on your podcast, probably actually before or after, I don't remember, that we've had some of the same guests. And so, and we were actually talking before we went live here that, our audiences, I think, are very much the same.
Yeah.
We're talking about reading today. And so I thought we'd start with your personal reading journey.
Mm,
Tell us about because it is a journey. I think all of us have a reading journey, and
yeah.
I think many of them are at least the first part of it, not unlike yours. But tell us about your reading journey.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
as a kid, I remember my mom reading to us and taking us to the library, and how much I enjoyed reading. And then I got to school, and I mean no ill will towards the teachers of the world. Some of the people who have impacted me more than anybody else have been teachers. My sister's a teacher. I love teachers, but Kevin, school had a way of educating out of me the desire to read, in large part because I was always having to read things that I wasn't interested in reading. And so it wasn't until I got out of school, and by the way, when school was over, when college was over, my attitude, literally, because of all the things I had to do that I didn't want to do, my attitude was, well, thank goodness the learning is over. I don't have to do that anymore, right? I mean, how naive and silly is that, right? So I stepped away and didn't do anything with regard to personal and professional development to speak of for the better part of 10 years. It wasn't until I was in my early 30s that a leader who I greatly admire to this day, best boss I ever had, introduced me to, first it was Seth Godin, Jim Collins, John Maxwell, Liz Wiseman, Pat Lencioni, some of those names you mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
And these were books that embarrassingly I did not realize were there. You talked about, we're going to have a cup of coffee today. And I think of now when I decide what book am I going to read, I think of, well, who do I want to have a cup of coffee with? Because that to me is what reading a book is like having a cup of coffee, an intimate conversation with the author. And when I dove into I think it was Purple Cow was that first book by Seth that I got in my hands, and I just thought it was amazing. I just thought there's more stuff out there like this, and that began a reading journey for me that just has continued. Obviously, these 18 years later, I just can't not read. It's just in me now, and it's not going away.
So, okay, so the next obvious question really is, how has reading changed your life? Because it has, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so talk about that. You and Jesse both talk about it in the book.
Mm,
I could tell my story, but I want. So how
sure.
has that? You made that change? Like I was a
Yeah.
reader as a kid, then I really wasn't. Sort of adamantly not. Rediscovered it,
Mm,
perhaps serendipitously.
yeah.
How's it changed your life, Jeff?
Well, immediately I saw my career trajectory at the time. Again, I was working at my last radio station. It would turn out to be later, but I almost instantly, began to see things take an uptick in the sense that as I read and as I began to act upon what I was reading and putting into practice and experimenting with what I was reading about, and at this time, I'm reading about things like marketing and how to better market our radio station and things related to social media a few years after this, and trying to figure out how is social media going to impact how we do what we do, and how can we leverage these tools to better impact and communicate more intimately with our listeners. And so as I began to experiment a bit, the things that I did that didn't work, frankly, were quickly forgotten, thankfully. But the things that I tried that worked, that stuck, got me noticed. And I realized very quickly, Kevin, that I was one of the few people in the entire company, and this was a company with stations all over the country, that was actually doing this thing. And so as I was experimenting and having some of those turn out to be successful, I began being asked to then, okay, teach others. Go teach the sales team from the entire country, everybody from around the nation, how you did this and what you're doing, so they can do some of those things and leverage some of those tools. Go teach the programming department what you're doing. And then that one thing led to another, and it turned into then the president of the company looking at, okay, what's my 10-year vision for 2010 to 2020? Yeah, this was a few years ago. And
Yeah.
saying, okay, I'm going to visit, several stations like a good leader does, and get input from the different stations and my people. And my leader said, Jeff, I want you to be the one to present on our behalf, in part because of all these things I was doing behind the scenes and reading. The president saw that presentation and said, you need to come and present that to the executive team. We're going to have a rank and file person come to the annual executive leader meeting, something they've never done before, and present to that team. And then that led to him coming to me later and saying, Jeff, I'm now ready to share my vision with the world. I want you to create the presentation I'm going to use to do that. All those things that I was asked to do, I learned by simply reading about those things, reading about presentations, reading about marketing, reading about social media. And they just led to opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. And then that's gone on, obviously, to carry on throughout my career now, working for myself. There was a time, Kevin, when this whole idea of earning a living on my own without having a regular job was just something I could not fathom. I couldn't see that actually happening. I didn't have that as a goal. It was the reading that I did that brought me to a place to even think about those things. Like, I could really do that. Like, Jeff, there's enough up here in my head that I could sell what I know. And it had it not been for the reading I was doing, that never would have happened.
So we see someone telling us that it's an inspiring story, but here's the thing. That can be all of our stories.
Yes.
I mean, the specifics of it, like you make a bold claim in the subtitle of the book, right? It says, the simple habit that expands your influence and boosts your career. Now, it's not a bold claim because you just proved it to us with your personal story.
Right.
You know, again, I said I could share a story. Lots of those of you that are here that are readers could share a similar story in some way. And well, for those of you that are here and say, well, I kind of would like to, I'm really, I'm listening to you, Jeff, but I'm just not a reader. Now, I know that you've heard them all. Like, what are the barriers? What are the resistors? What are the things you hear? What are the yes buts when they hear that story, or they say, man, you ought to read this book, and they say, yes, but Jeff, what are the yes buts that you hear? The biggest ones?
Yeah, probably the single biggest one, the one I hear more than any other, is I don't have time to read.
How did I know that was coming? I actually have a follow-up on that, but I want to hear some more.
Well, yeah, one of the first questions I'll ask when somebody says that is, two questions I'll ask is, one is, what are some of your favorite television shows? And sometimes they'll get 2 or 3 out of their mouth before they realize they just put their foot in their mouth, right?
I've been binging. Right?
Well, that may be the reason why you don't have time to read, because you're doing too much of this thing over here.
By the way, if you're with us live and you want to answer this question, like if you're that person, like I don't read, I'd like to read more or whatever. What's your yes but? Put it in the comments. And we won't necessarily call you out. That's not the point, but it'll be helpful, I think, for Jeff and I. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, some others. By the way, the other question I'll often ask is, do you schedule your reading time? We can get more into that in a moment. But some of the other yes buts are a lack of funds. I think books are one of the cheapest things we can do to learn and grow. I don't like, I'll get into a book and decide that I don't like what I'm reading, but I feel like I have to continue reading it. What do I do then? I read really slowly. I only like to listen to audiobooks. Those are some of the things that come to mind, as if audiobooks are somehow less than.
Like they count, right? Don't audiobooks count?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a time in my career, and I think this is the case for a lot of people, where I had decided that my only option based on my schedule, and now looking back on it, I might sort of challenge myself on this now, but at the time I felt like my only option to read was to leverage my commute time. And so I listened to audiobooks during that time, and at least was, getting some reading in. If that's all you can do today, absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now, just recognize that when it comes to implementation, if there are books you're reading that you want to execute on, we don't always have to read with that purpose in mind. We can read just on because it impacts our thinking on something, for example. But if you're looking to implement ideas from what you're reading, just know that you're going to need to set some time aside after listening to an audiobook to revisit it and write some things down and determine, what am I going to take action on, and when am I going to take that action?
Yeah. So which I want to come back to that. Amin says it's all about people's priorities. And you said that, do we schedule time? I want to come back to that. This whole idea of our priorities, though, I think is critical, right, to all this. And here, and Morty says he schedules time to read 30 minutes a day, but it leads to, I knew that one of the questions would be, Morty's got another question. I'll come back to that in just a second, Morty, but I want to stay with this idea of the time. How much time does it take? If the number one reason people say, well, I don't have time, and we could just point to, how much time they spend on their phone and how much time they spend on their television, all that stuff.
Sure.
But like, how much time should people be thinking about here?
Yeah, and Morty's got the right idea. I think in as little as 30 minutes a day, and that you might break that up. Maybe that's 15 minutes in the morning, maybe that's 15 minutes in the evening. Just make your goal something as simple as 5 pages. That breaking it up that way, that gives you 3 minutes per page. Most of us can finish a page in about 3 minutes. Maybe it's 5 pages in the morning, 5 in the evening, or 10 all at once. If you do that Monday through Friday, by the time you get to the end of the month, you've finished a 220 page book. Most business books, most personal development and professional development books are about that long. Make your goal early on, if you're not reading much at all now, to just try to complete a book a month. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew. So even just 10 pages a day, that's doable in 30 minutes. And you'll finish that book before the month's through.
We were talking with Jeff Brown, the co-author of the soon to be published at this moment, Read to Lead book, The Simple Habit That Expands Your Influence and Boosts Your Career. And it is, I was holding it up because it's 226 pages before you get to the end notes. So it is that long. So one of the things you said in the book that I really liked, and I've been thinking about it ever since I read it, is that not only do you kind of like that 30-minute time that Morty suggested, but you sort of suggest, or the two of you sort of suggest, if we're talking about reading to really study and understand and eventually implement, we'll get to implement in a little bit, that 20, 30 minutes at a time is probably all you want to do. So can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, you might want to do more than that a day, but you're saying at a sitting. So talk about that and the logic and the research behind that just a bit.
Yeah, I have found that when it comes to retention and comprehension, especially, that sort of following the Pomodoro technique, right? 25 minutes of focus, and then a 5-minute break, giving your brain a chance to rest, and then coming back for maybe another 25 minutes right after that, or at another time during the day or the next day. Really, the research shows aids in comprehension and retention. Sometimes, if I'm trying to get through a book a little bit more quickly, I might do a 50-minute reading session, but 25 feels really good to me, and that often doesn't mean that I get through an entire chapter, but I read to the extent that I can. But one thing that helps me get through chapters faster is in changing how I've been taking notes as of late. And I used to read a paragraph or two and stop and take notes, and read a paragraph or two and stop. And it's very difficult to get through much of a book in 25 minutes if you're doing it that way. And what I've done more recently is I limit myself to just making marks. I prefer physical books when I have access to them, and I'll make an asterisk for maybe something I want to dig into more deeply. I'll put a question mark for something I don't understand or maybe don't agree with. I'll write a cue for a quote that I think is particularly pithy, and just limit myself to that, and just literally read for 25 minutes. Take that 5-minute break. And then depending on how far I've gotten, if I've finished a section or a chapter in that amount of time, my next 25-minute Pomodoro is just note-taking. And so I've kind of separated those two actions out. So 25 minutes is just reading. Again, sometimes 50 if I'm feeling rather ambitious. And then 25 minutes of strictly note-taking. Those sort of sessions broken up that way, I have found, and I think the research shows too, helps with retention and comprehension, which of course lead to increasing the likelihood that you're actually going to act on what you're reading and execute on what you're reading.
Yeah, I want to get to that a little bit more in a minute. Amin says only 30 minutes a day can make you an expert in your field. And that's right. It gets to the point that Morty asks about, and I want to get there in a minute, about curating. So let's just go ahead and go there right now. He says, one of my challenges is deciding what to read. So how do you curate what to read? I think that I get asked that question a lot as well. I loved your advice in the book. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, what I do is I am never at a place or a point where I'm reading something that doesn't truly excite me. And so I think about the topics that excite you, the subject matter that excites you, the things that you're looking to want to get better at, whether that's connected to your vocation or your industry or your expertise. Think about the people that fascinate you. And know that with each one of those things you just thought of, there are not just a book on that person, place, or thing, but there are a plethora of books about those people, those places, those topics, those things. And when you start there with the books you're reading, you're going to find quite quickly that you'll never be bored, that you'll be driven to want to read more and more.
Well, one of the things that it's related to what you just said, Jeff, that I've done is people say, man, I love television. I watch television. I watch movies. I said, so what's one of your favorite movies? What's one of your favorite stars? Go read their biography or autobiography.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
Because first of all, you'll be interested in that.
Yes.
And I don't think you can. I mean, if you're interested in reading for the reasons we're talking about here, you will read a biography or an autobiography through the lens of what you can learn from what that successful person has done or not done.
Yes.
That you could apply. Agree?
Absolutely. One of my favorite authors, Brian J. Jones, has written autobiographies on George Lucas, on Jim Henson, on Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss. Devoured all three of those because I was impacted by all three of those men growing up and learned so much about leadership in the process of reading books about those folks. So yeah, I totally agree.
So this is the advantage, I suppose, Jeff, of doing this live is that, I don't get to talk about what I want to talk about. So Morty says, for retention, I have found a fantastic app called Readwiseio. It captures all the highlights you make in a Kindle and emails them back to you randomly. And are you nodding like you know it? Anything you want to say about that? And then talk about, because you and I are the same, physical books first. So just talk about that to Morty's point, but also sort of the ebook, Kindle versus physical book scenario.
Well, I think Morty and I were separated at birth, possibly because we're on the same wavelength. I just discovered the Readwise app within the last few weeks. In fact, I've been exchanging emails with them about possibly sponsoring the Read to Lead podcast. We're working on that right now. But I discovered that app and thought, gosh, where has this app been all my life? I love, like Morty indicated, the random highlights and selections you receive from the Kindle books you've read. But you can also take images of the physical books you're reading, and it will store those and bring those back up every so often and test you on them, remind you of the highlights, the things you wanted to remember. So it's just a great way to sort of keep what you're reading and particularly what you wanted to remember top of mind. So great app for that. Absolutely. Totally agree. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Well, I was going to say with regard to ebooks versus physical books, audiobooks, some of this, as I alluded earlier, will depend on sort of your season in life as to what one may work best for you right now. But a lot of times, too, for me, it's the kind of book I'm reading. If I'm reading fiction or if I'm reading a biography, I might be much more likely to listen to that book. If I'm reading a book that I'm going to then make a list of to-dos and actions and things that I'm going to go execute on later, and I kind of know that going in, I want the physical book in my hand that I'm going to mark up a great deal. But if, when it comes to ebooks, I will say that's probably my least favorite medium. I have a Kindle at my wife's insistence to kind of lessen the number of physical books we have in the house. It hasn't clicked with me really. But
yeah, our wives could have a conversation.
Yes,
I guarantee you.
But there isn't, I don't think necessarily one way that's better than the other. It's really what works for you right now, where you are in that season of life. But again, I sometimes will enjoy certain mediums more than others, depending on the kind of book. As of late, I first did this with Brendan Burchard's High Performance Habits book a couple of years ago. I've really gotten into reading a physical book or ebook while having the author read the book to me as I follow along at high speeds. And so I have found that combining two mediums has done wonders for my retention and my comprehension. So if you haven't tried that, and oh, by the way, if you also want to get through the book a little faster, listening to just the audiobook by itself at that speed is something I'm not quick to do. But when I can have the physical book in front of me and literally follow along at that speed, it's done wonders for the number of books I read and how fast I get through them.
That is fast. I don't even think that's in the book. Everybody, I don't think it's in the book. So you said it earlier, and I don't want us to get out of this conversation without you talking about it. And it's something you spend a lot of time about in the book is a reading plan, having a reading plan. And I love the fact that you guys talk about it. And I love the fact that you talk about not everyone's will be the same, but talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think you have to set some goals. We talked about deciding or ways to discern. Well, what books do I want to read? Acquire some of those books. Don't try to tackle them all at once, but can create what Michael Hyatt, one of my mentors, calls an ideal week, and decide with regard to books. You can do this for life in general, but decide with regard to books. What's my plan here? What do I want to get out of this book? And start with the end in mind, as Stephen R. Covey says. Highly effective habit number 2, and decide for yourself, what do I want to get out of this book? Set a goal, know what that is, and as you begin reading, be looking for things that lend themselves to the goal. And that means potentially, say, for example, not starting with chapter number 1, particularly with nonfiction books. We're not talking about fiction here, obviously, but you might, based on that.
Well, that
goal,
would just be more fun, Jeff. Just start with chapter 7.
yeah, kind of hard, but with a nonfiction book, you can look at that goal and go, okay, well, that means I'm going to start with chapter 6, and then I'm going to move to chapter 11, etc., and give yourself that freedom. You may also get into that book, as we hinted earlier, and go, you know what, this is not doing it for me. I need to move on. Give yourself, that used to be very tough for me. Give yourself permission to move away from a book, but do also, when you start a book, when you begin a book, know what the next book is going to be. Have the next book in the queue, especially for those times when you decide that a book isn't doing it for you and you're ready to move on to the next one. Having it ready, at the ready, is great. Or if you get through a book much faster than you anticipated for some other reason, you're going to lessen the amount of downtime and slowing down the reading process when you've got that next book in the queue. So
that is never going to be a problem for me, Jeff.
Yes, well, it's not for me either.
If I had a really good camera and I panned around, you would see just a small portion of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 bookcases in this office, and that's not all of it, right? So yeah, and the stacks. So, but I think it's really good advice. I think it's really super good advice, and having a plan for anything is valuable. And I don't think most of us have thought about a reading plan. So I appreciate you sharing that. Anything else you want to add about that?
Yeah, something I would add to that. I read a year or two ago Dr. B.J. Fogg's Tiny Habits. I also read a few years ago Atomic Habits, a similarly themed book by James Clear. One of the things I love about Fogg's advice here, and this is especially for anyone who might be listening now who thinks, well, gosh, 10 pages a day seems kind of overwhelming, or whatever the thing is, or a book a month. I'm just not sure I can pull that off right now. Make it tiny. Your goal tomorrow might be sitting down with that cup of coffee and opening the book and reading the first paragraph or the first sentence, or it might just be opening the book to the first page, celebrating that, and then moving on with your day. Fogg talks about this in relation to finally getting around to flossing his teeth. He started with, my goal today is going to be to floss one tooth, and the next day, and the next, and eventually you be, whether it's reading or teeth, you get to the point where you're like, well, I'm doing this anyway. Why don't I just keep going? Right. But the key is doing that, tying it to something you already do every day anyway, like say making a cup of coffee, making it tiny, and then celebrating it afterwards, and truly, legitimately, sincerely celebrating it with a victory signal with your hands in the air, or a Tiger Woods style fist bump, or a yes, or whatever. And that's going to tell your brain, oh, this is something I like. I want more of this. And you'll gradually work your way up to reading more and for longer periods of time.
So earlier you were talking about how you take notes in a book, and I'm writing down cues and asterisks and dots, and I'm using a highlighter perhaps, and all this stuff. And people are saying, Jeff, you said you didn't want to do any of that after college, and now you're doing it again. and so a lot of people say, well, I don't retain what I read. And you guys talk a lot about retention in the book, but I think you and I both mentioned it now several times, and I promised we'd get to here. The people that are listening to or watching this podcast or this live care about getting better. So it isn't just about sort of intellectually capturing it. It's about implementing it or executing on it. I happen to like the word implement because the word execute feels kind of, even though I had Jim Hewling on here, we talked about the 4 Disciplines of Execution, which is a fabulous book. I like the word implement because it feels a little better than that other meaning of the word execute. But the point is, beyond sort of what you've already shared, how do you get from, okay, I read this, to it really making a difference in my work and in my life?
One of the things I like to do and is to teach the material, find excuses, find reasons, find ways to share with other people what I'm learning. That was one of the sort of origins of my podcast. There didn't seem to be enough people around me at the time to share with what I was reading. I find that when you've got people around you to share what you're learning about and who can join in that conversation with you, the likelihood of you executing is greatly increased. So whether that's teaching it one-to-one or sitting down with somebody over a cup of coffee and sharing your exuberance for what you've read and getting their thoughts and opinions, to maybe in a meeting, maybe you get permission from your leader, or maybe you are the leader and you ask to just share some about what you learned with the staff. Maybe it's more formally as part of a book club, one that exists or one that you launch, or maybe it's at a lunch and learn, in front of members of your local chamber of commerce or something, or any other local or online group. If nothing else, begin sharing what you're learning and grappling with via social media, and invite people in to have conversations with you about that. And these conversations are going to spur you on to read even more. And again, when it comes to actually executing on what you're reading, those people around you are going to encourage you to do that, and that just makes it so much easier in the long run.
I just have to stop you right there and say what you just said could change the world. Like, I'm being serious. So, some people are with us on multiple platforms right now live. And so they're in a social media platform. Everyone who's listening to this later they're likely doing it on their phone, which means they have social media. And a lot of us say, what about our social media? Well, it's so negative. It's so this, so that. What if you were sharing a big idea you got from a book, or we're sharing, here's what I'm hoping to implement. What do you think about this? What if we started posting that in our social media feeds, not only for our own personal benefit, for the reasons you just shared, Jeff, but, Gandhi says, be the change you want to see in the world, right? So if we start posting different sorts of things, creating different kinds of conversations, it literally could change the world around us at a minimum. I love that. I hope that everyone who's listening to this later, stop, go back and listen to that again. Go back about 3 minutes. Listen to Jeff again. I think that is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Jeff.
Oh, thanks for saying that. I appreciate it.
So I felt like I had a podcast expert on here, and I've never asked this kind of question. I've never sort of gotten this is a show, this is a podcast about leadership and all that. But I wanted, sometimes leaders are thinking this, and sometimes people are thinking this. If I wanted to start a podcast, Jeff, if someone wants to start a podcast, what are 3 things? There's a lot more than 3, I know, but what are 3 things you'd want them to know or think about if they were thinking about doing that?
Yeah, the first thing to think about would be answering the question for yourself, why? Like pretend someone comes to you and says, why are you going to do this podcast? And knowing what the answer to that question is. And so if someone were to ask that of me with regard to Read to Lead, my answer is because I believe that intentional and consistent reading is key to success in business and in life. It has been for me. It has been for thousands of others. And that's why I do it. Now, I go so far as to share that in every introduction of my show, but from a more listener-friendly camera angle. That version I just gave was kind of like the All About Jeff version, but we're all kind of more interested in what's in it for me and us. And so the version I share on the show is, if you want true success in business and in life, if you want transformation, etc., then guess what? Intentional and consistent reading is a must. So I basically put it out there. And this is what you've got to articulate for your own show. You've got to be able to communicate with listeners. If you want a certain XYZ transformation, what have you, out of life, then there's this ABC thing over here you have to do. and it draws a line in the sand. It basically forces your listeners to pick a side. And when you can do that, you eliminate sort of the indifference. I once had somebody say to me, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference.
Yeah.
And so when you can force people to pick a side, you've all but eliminated indifference. Now, those who agree with your point of view, they'll likely continue listening because they know they're going to get their own beliefs affirmed. But even those who maybe disagree, because your worldview, your why, has been shared and expressed in an emphatic, unapologetic, confident way, you've piqued their curiosity. And so many of them are going to be listening because they want to hear you defend
They
what you
want to
so
lean in
vehemently
and
believe.
hear that, right?
Yes, exactly. So that would be the first thing, is know why you're doing it. Um, have a plan with regard to content, and by that I mean know how often you're going to publish, but the format. Like, am I going to do interviews every time? Am I going to vary that up like my friend Jeff Sanders does, where one week it's him by himself, the next week it's an interview? Whatever you decide is up to you, but be consistent as you can, as consistent as you can with whatever that schedule is. If that's every Tuesday, if that's interviews every other week, whatever that is, just be consistent so your listeners can get into a rhythm and know what to expect from you.
And one of the reasons I shared that is that, I occasionally hear, and I'm guessing that you hear about this far more than I do, is organizations thinking about internal podcasts, and organizations and leaders thinking about how they could use this type of medium inside their organization. So hopefully that was helpful to someone. And I appreciate you sharing some of that.
Oh, my pleasure.
With us, Jeff. So I'm going to shift gears. We're in the short rows, as the farmer in me would say, of the show. And so I want to know what you do for fun, Jeff. Besides read, what do you do for fun?
Oh man, I thought I was going to say. Well, I kind of teased, those who watched too much television earlier. I mean, I have the shows that I enjoy, but that's also something that I'm very intentional about. But more than television, I enjoy a good flick, a good movie every now and then. So I do that for fun. I'm a runner, though with the heat we've had, I've not done much of that recently. So I like listening to audiobooks and podcasts while I run. But so I do that. I don't know if I can say running has ever been fun, but I know that it's necessary. It's how I get my exercise primarily. But I just love movies. Impacted me growing up as a kid, and I just remember that experience in the movie theater, and a film that really moved me or got me excited. And so though it's rarer today, I would say, than in my youth, I enjoy sitting down at home primarily these days with my wife and just enjoying a good film, the two of us together. So
then the only question now we'd have a whole other show about curating movies between you and a spouse, but that is not the topic today, everybody. So for long time listeners, they know the question that maybe or know it's coming, and maybe even know that it's coming next. Yeah. And I joked with you before we started, Jeff, because it's the only question I always tell guests is coming, because sometimes people need a chance to think about it. And I laughed when I told you. So Jeff, what are you reading these days? And keep it to a short list here.
Yes.
But give people 2 or 3 things that you're reading, maybe that you really are loving, or that you think people might find valuable.
Yeah, there are a couple of books I've read recently, especially for the Read to Lead podcast, and then a couple that I'm kind of reading and dipping my toe in the water every so often as I get a chance to. And the two I think of immediately that I've read for interviews that I've done is Mike Kim's "You Are the Brand." It's an 8-step blueprint for developing and building a personal brand. Great book, and Mike is an expert at that. And I just finished a book last night called "The Magnetic Leader" by Chris McClure. 18 Essential Actions of Leaders People Love to Follow. He's an executive leadership coach. A great book from Chris. And then on a personal level, a couple of books I've been reading. One is How to Take Smart Notes, 1 Simple Technique to Boost Writing, Learning, and Thinking for Students, Academics, and Nonfiction Book Writers. It's a mouthful. By, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but I think it's Sankey Ahrens, I think is how you pronounce that. So
how to take smart notes. And everybody, we'll have all these in the show notes. You can capture them, but go ahead. Last one.
Yeah, the last one, and this is really a public speaking related book. I'm always reading books about public speaking to just better that skill. It's called "Do You Talk Funny? 7 Comedy Habits to Become a Better and Funnier Public Speaker" by David Nihill.
4 books from you, Jeff. So now, but let's talk one more time about your book, because right now, if people, we both got it, we'll do it. Let's do it in stereo. So for those that are here live, and there's a big advantage to you being here live or listening to this, sort of in social media in the near term, because the book's about to come out. And how can we learn more about you and your work and the book and all that?
Well, thank you for giving me that opportunity. I really appreciate it, Kevin. If you're listening to this or watching this live or hearing this before August 31st, then you are in luck because you can get the book for 40% off at readtoleadbook.com. And I always say, well, that's almost half off, so you might as well buy two at that point, right? But readtoleadbook.com.
It's okay. I've got it wrong on the screen. I will fix that. It's readtoleadbook.com.
And you also get $500 in free resources when you pre-order the book. That includes the audiobook. I have a lot of people ask me, having done a podcast for 8 years, Jeff, are you doing an audiobook? The answer is yes, but don't buy it. Pre-order the physical book and you'll get the audiobook for free. Again, that's readtoleadbook.com before August 31st. If it's after August 31st, maybe you're on the fence, you want to kick the tires, you can do this now too, right away. But you can get the introduction in the first chapter for free at readtoleadbook.com. And the book, of course, will continue to be available there regardless of when you happen to be hearing this.
Okay, so the introduction and the first chapter is why you need to read like your career depends on it. I will tell you this, you need to get the whole book, but if you just read that chapter, it'd be well worth your time. That'd be an awfully good place to start, especially for that person on the fence about all of this. So now I've got a question for all of you who are watching and listening. And I ask you this every single week. Now what? What are you going to do? Now this week, it should be pretty simple. You're going to pick up a book. You're going to schedule 15 minutes to start. You're going to start to curate a list. You're going to do something, I hope. Because if all you do is say, man, that was interesting, Jeff was entertaining, and man, you can tell why he was on the radio. He's got an amazing voice. That's good. That's not reason enough to come back. The thing is, what are you going to do with what you learned today? That's the key. I hope that you will take that question seriously, and I hope you will take maybe you learn something about how you're going to take notes in a book, or how you're going to make sure that you implement what you learned from a book, or I don't know what you took, but the thing is, it's taking action that matters. And I hope that you'll do exactly that. Jeff, I've been looking forward to this. It was a pleasure. Thanks for being here. And thanks for doing it live as well, even though the actual podcast version won't be out for quite a while.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. This was a real treat. I'm delighted to do it. So thank you so much.
Before I go, everyone, just to remind you that this episode has been brought to you by Remarkable Master Classes, and each month a new skill from me, from this location. And you can learn more about all of that and how to get discounts each month by going to remarkablemasterclass.com. If you enjoyed this week, you'll enjoy next week and every week that follows. And I'll be here with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.